Nevermore Notes presents Berenice by Edgar Allan Poe. Introduction. Edgar Allan Poe's short story Berenice was published in 1835. Very little is known about what happened to him during this time in his life, but what we do know suggests he might have been in a dark place. Poe's foster father, John Allan, had died just a year before in 1834. Accounts are unreliable, but generally painted a picture that Poe and Allan did not reconcile before his death, as John Allan left provisions in his will for both his illegitimate and legitimate children, but nothing for Poe himself. And in 1835, destitute, Poe wrote to his friend Kennedy, hoping to get a position as a school teacher. Kennedy invited him over for dinner, and Poe had to decline, stating that his overall appearance was unsuitable for company. And Kennedy responded to Poe's poor condition by feeding him, clothing him, helping him get regular exercise, and helping him get in contact with the Southern Literary Magazine. And shortly thereafter, the magazine published Berenice. At the time, Berenice's graphic nature caused quite a stir in the literary community. Later publications omit about 4 of the most graphic paragraphs within the story. Poe says of Berenice, "The subject is far too horrible, and I confess that I hesitated in sending it." However, he goes on to cajole the messenger to publish it regardless, saying, "The history of magazines show plainly that those which have attained celebrity were indebted for it to articles similar to the nature of Berenice." Poe continues, "To be appreciated, you must be read." And these things are invariably sought after with avidity. Berenice is one of the few stories where I could find no analysis that claimed there were autobiographical elements in it, which I think is interesting because, at least to me, it had some of the most revealing autobiographical qualities to Poe's work I've read so far. After all, the story is about first cousins proposing to each other and preparing to get married. And a year after this was published in 1836, Poe marries his own first cousin, Virginia. She was 13 when he was 27, so while marrying first cousins is common in this time period, the age gap there is not. The relationship between Poe and Virginia is framed in different ways depending on who's telling the story. We're never going to know the truth of how things were. But there is a world where Poe feels obligated to propose to Virginia and that he cares for her only in a platonic way. There's a world where Virginia wants or needs Poe for a plethora of reasons, all of which leads me to ask, is it possible that Poe utilizes Berenice to explore his own complicated emotions and relationships with Virginia? How is Poe similar or different from Aegeus? Is Poe and Virginia's relationship similar to Aegeus and Berenice's? Which moves us into talking about the writing style. Poe's style has strong influence from the Romantic movement. His prose prioritize emotions, reference classic Greek mythic elements, linger in the supernatural and the fanciful, has a profound amount of description, invite readers to identify with the narrator, and the style of the Romantic movement pairs very well with Poe's horror as it prepares readers to react viscerally to the horror, have graphic imagery of all horrific scenes, and remain defenseless against the otherworldly. Look for references to classic Greek mythology. Times the narrative lingers in a speculatively gray area, without grounding the work in the physical. Examples of description, specifically those examining internal emotions. How emotion builds fear, tension, and connection to the events. Today, Poe's well known for his Gothic work, and Berenice is perhaps the most gory addition to his collection. Berenice shares several Gothic themes, and they include sanity. Aegeus's unreliable nature stems from his mental condition. He's reluctant to even acknowledge his unique perspective is a result of a diagnosed condition, despite the fact all the doctors tending to him tell him he is unwell. The horror in Berenice is less in questioning what's real and what's not, and more in examining what an ill person might do to the innocent. Isolation. Aegeus and Berenice are both isolated on their old family manor. Reality as a whole seems like the dream, and dreams the reality for Aegeus. Arguably, the isolation the two have is what leads to both their bad ends. If a doctor had examined Berenice before they buried her, they'd have found her alive, and if anyone had kept an eye on Aegeus, he probably wouldn't have been left free to do what he did to Berenice. questioning death. Berenice is buried alive, so it leaves us with lots of questions. How can one be sure someone is dead? What happens after death? Is there a supernatural something that ensures we all die at the proper time? Can one avoid a gruesome fate? The supernatural. It's implied there's nothing supernatural going on in Berenice. However, Poe does make use of folklore to impact Aegeus's perception. There's just enough mystery for readers to wonder if possibly something supernatural drives Aegeus, rolling us into evil. Aegeus acts in evil and malice. Whether it's the evil inherent within all humans, a topic Poe routinely covers, or this is some outside force using cracks in Aegeus's mind to manipulate him to bad ends, is up for reader interpretation. There is a bonus theme of the evil within Berenice. Might there truly be some loss of morality or purity within her that makes her a danger to Aegeus? All of which rolls us into dark romanticism. This is a term that was coined by Mario Praz in the 1930s. It combines the romantic and the gothic movement together, and it's sort of describing how Poe takes on a lot of the sound of the romantic movement while exploring opposing themes. So where the romantic movement has all this hopeful whimsy and idealism, Poe is all about the inherent evil, melodrama, and darkness in the human soul. Dark romanticism focuses in on the uncanny, human fallibility, self-destruction, judgment, and punishment. It takes positive emotions and perverts them into something sinister. For example, love becomes lust. Daydreams become nightmares. Affection becomes violent obsession. Unlike Gothic fiction, dark romanticism has a specific time period span and only means anything in context of the Romantic period. So Poe's works are Gothic fiction, but because of when he wrote them, they're also dark romantic fiction. And now let's talk about the actual story of Berenice, starting with the Epigraph. We open with the original Latin quote can be found here from Ibn Zayat. The English translation is, "My companion said to me, if I would visit the grave of my friend, I might somewhat allay my worries." Ibn Zayat. So Ibn Zayat, as we can see quoted in the original text, or Ben Zayat, as I found reference to in original texts when I was looking to see who this person was. It seems they were a descendant of an oil merchant. They were a grammarian and a poet of Baghdad. And this one quote is from a eulogy on the loss of a beloved slave girl. Looking this epigraph up kind of difficult, and there being some overall weirdness with it. The quote hails from the Kitab al-Gayan, or the Book of Songs, and it was written in French, not Latin. So the source for this Latin version Poe quotes is entirely unknown. And this is further unusual because epigraphs usually set the tone for the work to come. The characters themselves do not usually interact with these lines. However, Poe circles back to this quote at the end of Berenice, and we learn that Aegeus has a book open to these lines as he's confronting what he's done. So more about all this at the conclusion, but for now, I'll ask, what feelings does this quote leave you with? Do you have any guesses about where the story will go from here? What expectations does this set up for Berenice, and do you think the story delivers on them? Moving into the events of the story proper. We are in a large, old, wealthy mansion. It's got like towers and art galleries and the biggest library you've ever seen in your life. And our narrator is this guy called Aegeus. He's well off with a large family home, and his mom died in childbirth. It's important to note many of Poe's works use first-person narration. In this early attempt, Aegeus remains well-defined. He's his own character, and he's a little bit weird, which makes it somewhat difficult for readers to identify with him or to self-insert. However, this first-person narration still invites an extra layer of closeness between the readers and the narrator. It's as if Aegeus is speaking directly to us. So do you identify with Aegeus, despite his best efforts to be different? Also, Aegeus lets us know he believes in reincarnation. His proof of this is some kind of like pre-remembering flashes of light and sound that don't make a whole lot of sense. He says the memories are shadowy and incomplete, but undeniable. And I had to wonder if this was a little bit of misdirection from Poe. As in Mezzenstein, reincarnation plays a pivotal role in the events of the story. But as Berenice unfolds, reincarnation is never brought up again. So is Poe, clumsily implying that Eugenius and Berenice have a connection in a past life, using a non-Christian religious belief as further proof of how unwell and spiritually compromised Eugenius is, trying to provide more age or wisdom to a younger character with half-remembered past lives, introducing a more speculative, supernatural element early on to make readers more susceptible later in the work. Does your interpretation of this inclusion color how you view the story going forward? And we find out not all is well with Eugenius. Minimally a recluse, Eugenius describes a feeling of disconnection from reality. Dreams and imaginings feel more real to him than the outside world beyond the boundaries of his home. Which is when we're introduced to Berenice, who is Eugenius's cousin, and the polar opposite of him in any way that matters. She's described as agile, graceful, and energetic. She is happy herself and she brings joy to those around her. And to me, how we're supposed to read Eugenius's and Berenice's relationship is colored by Poe's own life and his marriage to his cousin Virginia. What kind of love Poe and Virginia shared. This fraught, bordering on overly close relationships and family continue to reoccur in Poe's works. Is this a sign that Poe is grappling with his own relationship with many family members? Which brings us into Eugenius losing his Berenice. Eugenius writes about it originally as like some kind of death of Berenice, but we come to find out that an illness has fallen over her. It's some form of epilepsy followed by long bouts of stillness. For reasons never elaborated, Eugenius applies some kind of like moral loss or failing as a result of this illness. And he asserts what's left is not his Berenice. So this is probably going to feel like a little bit of me going out on a limb, but guys, why not vampires? Berenice has some strange connections to its story and those of classic vampires. After all, Berenice is a happy-go-lucky, blonde, young girl. The exact kind of maiden that historically it seems like vampires like to prey on. Berenice once loved the sun and the outdoors and being active, and now she stays inside and seems frail and thin and gloomy. Her strained, tired appearance, the fact that she's left in a trance, it's much like how victims of vampires are described slowly being drained of vitality. Berenice never speaks a word in this story, and often vampire victims are left unable to communicate about their own attack. And Eugenius ascribes some kind of moral failing to Berenice for falling ill. And often in vampire attacks, there's like this complicated feeling of taint that's associated with it draining and feeding on their victims. And this is when, surprise, we find out that Eugenius is sick too and just hasn't felt like telling us about it till now. And Eugenius is very clear. According to doctors, he's sick. But the kind of language he uses makes it seem like he probably doesn't agree. And he has this kind of like obsessive concentration on one thing. It's described as a monomania, but the periods he sits in reflection grow and he loses all attention or recognition of anything outside the one element. Yet let me not be misapprehended. The undue, earnest, and morbid attention thus existed by objects in their own nature frivolous must not be confounded in character with that rumination propensity common in all mankind, and more especially indulged by persons of ardent imagination. Berenice by Edgar Allan Poe. Eugenius goes to strong lengths to kind of imply that he is not like the others. Emphasizes the amount of suffering this kind of fixation imposes upon him versus the pleasant feelings of daydreams or like an idle mind pondering that creative people usually indulge in. It makes him less relatable to readers and possibly less likable, just depending on how you interpret him clarifying his own illness, and that left me asking, is this how Edgar Allan Poe views himself? Is Poe attempting to build separation between the narrator and reader to ease the events ahead of us? Do you think that Aegeus views himself as special or tortured or some combination of the two? And we learn that for Aegeus, reading makes his condition worse. He outlines several works he became fixated on. He displays good memory, and at one point in time he fixates on the Tutilian de Carne Christi. The specific Latin phrase is up here, but the English translation is, "The Son of God died. It is immediately credible, because it is silly. He was buried and rose again. It is certain, because it is impossible." So who was Tertullian? He's the father of Latin Christianity and the founder of Western theology. Poe chose this quote from the De Carne Christi, which primarily argues on why Christ became flesh. More interesting than the quote's original intention is how it's been twisted over time. It's become the origin of Quiddo Quira Absurdum, or I believe because it is absurd, and notably absurd is a synonym for impossible. However, the implications of absurd do not align with Tertullian's initial message. So how this quote could relate to Berenice. Aegeus is justifying all that's to come. It's beyond what readers could be expected to believe, but the fact that it is impossible should verify that these events are true. And Aegeus is signaling that something miraculous might be around the corner. Just because it's miraculous doesn't mean it's good. And it could be some foreshadowing. Berenice is buried alive, which may be hinted at in this Tertullian line as it's about Christ rising from the dead himself. Even the classic misinterpretation of this line, I believe because it is absurd, might signal that either Aegeus or the readers themselves are misinterpreting or misrepresenting some information. So Aegeus hyperfixates on Berenice and all her illness has stolen from her. He claims that he loved who Berenice was, not in a romantic physical sense, but as an idea. And he's come to fear and resent how Berenice is now. But also he feels guilty about his fear and resentment over a once beloved cousin, and perhaps he even feels pity for how she's been reduced. Is this what it means to love but not be in love, as one perhaps should feel with friends or family? Is this an exploration of asexuality or the different ways one might express love and affection, especially when divorced from the physical component? Is this just evidence that Aegeus lacks all sense of physicality, even elements that we would take for granted? How are readers meant to interpret this fear and loathing and resentment that's taken hold for his cousin? But we're not given a lot of time to sit with that because Aegeus just randomly proposes to Berenice, as one does when a person terrifies and disgusts them. So one cold dark night, Aegeus is out looking at a window and Berenice approaches him. Aegeus describes this immense fear and suffering from her presence, but realistically, she walks up to the bro, smiles, and then leaves, which is all it takes for Aegeus to lock onto her teeth. They're white, they're straight, they're perfect. They embody everything Berenice was and no longer can be. Aegeus becomes consumed with them. So is Aegeus some kind of evil tooth fairy? We're back to counting those teeth with Poe. Berenice continues Poe's obsession with teeth. In his work, teeth often symbolize mortality. So Berenice has these beautiful, perfect white teeth to match Aegeus's memory of her past self. That she retained these pristine teeth while the rest of her wastes away seems a mockery. It may hint that though Berenice is ill, she may have many long years to live. She may even still be joyful though Aegeus no longer sees her that way. It could just be that Aegeus covets what he can't have. After all, he imagines every angle and detail of those teeth. He assigns each one a moral character. He twists a famous French phrase by Mademoiselle de Sales. All his steps were feeling, to all her teeth were ideas. And Aegeus is a creature of mind and thought. He has to have those teeth. Which brings me back to vampires. As vampiric lore may be hinted at in Aegeus's obsession, through his mental illness he views the very passive Berenice as a threatening figure imbued with vampiric magic. All of Berenice's symptoms match those of someone falling prey to a vampire and slowly turning into one themselves. It's only logical for Aegeus to fear the creature that was once Berenice, and for him to worry that she will come to him at night and destroy him too. And it also kind of matches Poe's themes of mortality as what lives longer than a vampire. And through this, Poe may be using the premise of Berenice to show how absurd vampiric tales are. From an outsider's perspective, Berenice is not a vampire and she does not have the power to hurt Aegeus. Aegeus's obsession and terror is absurd. And doesn't all vampire horror have that sort of silly, fearing something that can't harm you and a level of unnecessary gore to sort of shock you into it? But unlike vampire horror that goes to great lengths to convince people of its validity, Poe wants readers to see how unfounded Aegeus's horrors are. Aegeus's perceptions and beliefs are meant to be implausible, perhaps even laughable to readers. It's the absurdity of his view combined with how far he goes that creates the horror. And as Aegeus obsesses over Berenice's teeth, his own health deteriorates. He spends more and more time in his own mind. He doesn't eat or sleep with only Berenice's teeth for company. This already isolated man drifts farther and farther from reality. So Aegeus's own illness picking up might be more evidence of vampiric witchcraft, as his symptoms line up with the thrall that vampire victims classically fall under. It could also be Berenice as a fledgling vampire, beginning her feeding cycles on those she loved most. Or it could just be Aegeus projecting his own turn for the worst onto Berenice. Either way, Berenice dies. A crying servant wakes Aegeus from a reverie. We learn that Berenice died that morning of an epileptic seizure, and they've made arrangements for the funeral to happen this evening. Aegeus fades back out into his dream world. Now, in the original, there's 4 paragraphs with Aegeus actually attending this funeral, noticing Berenice smiling and moving her fingers, realizing she's still alive, and coming back to the gravesite after she's been buried to dig her up and surgically remove those teeth, where he ends up leaving Berenice alive graveside while returning with her teeth to his library. But in most versions, he simply comes to sitting in his library, noticing there's a dirty shovel near him and a doctor's box with instruments sitting by him, and this feeling of unsettled dread. He hears the servants, they are in a state of panic. And that's when Aegeus learns Berenice's grave has been violated. Her mutilated, still living body was found. The servant points out Aegeus's muddy clothes and the shovel nearby. Terror shoots through Aegeus. He screams. The doctor's box he couldn't quite open falls from his hand, and a bunch of teeth roll across the floor. So one more time with this vampiric lore. Aegeus removes Berenice's teeth, not just as a fixation, but perhaps because he fears them. They are all that remain strong and healthy within her. Should she choose to strike out against him, those teeth would be her best weapon. Berenice in many ways is poking fun of that classic gothic damsel. At first innocent and perfect in every way, and later changed for the worst. Berenice is unaware of her own changes, which is something often attributed to vampiric victims, and yet we see nothing but the weak, helpless woman in Berenice. Is this the unspeakable, supernatural horror of the vampire that has terrified so many? Is this the threat that drives men to the perverse mutilation of a corpse? Violence as graphic as what was originally found in Berenice was not typical in literature of the time. Worse, there's really no higher purpose to all of the gore. Aegeus's motivation appears purely psychotic, without conscious logic or reason attached. Critics struggle with subtle messaging and the reason Aegeus acts. But the true horror might be that the reason is meaningless, known only to a madman. and beyond that which we could grapple with, drawing us into conclusions. Let's circle back to that epigraph at the top. Now, personally, I found the epigraph a bit of a clumsy misdirect. As someone who's never read Berenice, after reading the epigraph and knowing Poe as I do, I sort of expected a man obsessed with a pretty woman who dies young, assumed going to the grave for closure at the end might lead to us learning that the grave has been robbed, or perhaps she'd been buried alive, or that he is so obsessed at seeing her one more time he digs up the grave and finds out there's no body in there at all, implying the whole situation is a delusion. Obviously, that's not what happened. And while elements of my theory prove correct thematically, Berenice feels very disjointed from the epigraph. Aegeus has no companions. Visiting the grave can't alleviate his suffering, nor can it inflame it. As the quote is originally about a relationship between a master and a slave, perhaps we're led to believe there's something illicit in the relationship between Aegeus and Berenice, but marrying first cousins is normal in this time frame, so that kind of feels like a dead end. Additionally, Aegeus goes to some lengths to convince readers he's not in love with Berenice, and views proposing to her as some kind of weakness or as like a personal favor to the healthy girl he once knew. Aegeus has a book open to these lines in the last 3 paragraphs of Berenice, and the final line fills him with dread and foreboding. He doesn't recall what he's done, but Aegeus fears it was monstrous. And overall, I'd say visiting the grave was mixed. Removing all the teeth from a still conscious woman is an unspeakable pain and horror. But Berenice was buried alive. Had Aegeus not gone to her grave, would she have died in that tomb? Is Berenice's fate better because of Aegeus's intervention? Poe stated he loves to include the death of a beautiful woman within his works, which in and of itself kind of smacks of misogyny, seeing women as nothing more than victims, and often not even that, simply props symbolizing the more innocent and helpless in society, meeting terrible ends to instill some kind of cheap thrill in the public, has deep and toxic roots in the horror community. Of all of Poe's characters, Berenice is perhaps the most offensive. As little is known about her, and unlike future beautiful women abused by their family like Madeline in The Fall of the House of Usher, Berenice has no power to extract revenge. Berenice is also not a great depiction of mental health. While Poe's works often portray mentally unwell people as the villains, he usually does better showcasing them as full people. He examines what they think and how they feel. We see how they slip into a madness. One can fear the acts committed, but also feel pity for them as they're struggling with something beyond an 1830s understanding of mental health. There's often this kinship between the mad person and the reader themselves. Someone might actually be afraid that they could also easily fall into the same kind of madness. Berenice showcases a significantly less nuanced version of a mentally ill criminal, one meant solely to demonize. Unlike future mad narrators, Aegeus waits a long time before telling us he's unwell. And he's so offhanded about it, it's like he doesn't even believe he's sick at all. At the same time, he insists that he suffers greatly in a way no one else can understand. Aegeus lacks any empathy for his cousin and Berenice's struggles, while demanding readers give sympathy to him. The build-up to the violent act, both in its original form and in its edited form, is abrupt, feeling more random than inevitable. There's just not enough creepy, scary time with Berenice to suggest a supernatural cause. Later characters have more than one creepy scene to justify their actions before they plunge the knife in. And I think all of this is kind of an example of how capitalism is bad and has always been bad. As Poe used Berenice's victimization and Aegeus's madness to farm outrage and general sales, we know that Poe can do better than the story of Berenice, and that implies to me its awkwardness exists to create outrage and generate sales. Poe was incentivized to intentionally do worse than he could, and Poe doesn't care about what people think about this specific story. He's clear that the measure of success for Berenice is the amount of sales it brought in. So it's worth examining Berenice as compared to later works because it lacks the sympathy and horror that those works will instill. And that's intentional from Poe, not a lack of skill. In the modern era, we discuss clickbait and the negativity you can find on the news and social media, as if it's this new, unstoppable phenomenon. But almost 200 years ago, Poe noticed horror and gore and negativity is what sells magazines. And he was social engineering his way into a payday. So this should lead us to ask, what do you value in art? And do you support what you value, or do you give energy to things you hate? How often do you fall to clickbait titles? And do you boost its intention through comments and likes and all the things? Is there a way beyond legislation to curb intentionally exploitative or provocative stories from predominating public attention? And there is a certain level of codependence between Eugeias and Berenice that's worth exploring. Eugeias starts out weak and sickly. Through daily contact with Berenice, it appears like he grows stronger. And Berenice weakens and shrivels up. It implies Eugeias is draining vitality from his cousin. And Wallace is explored most thoroughly in Poe's The Fall of the House of Usher, with Roderick and Madeline as twins. Berenice and Eugeias seem to have a similarly connected element, and like this I would say that they're two halves of the same whole, with Eugeias being the mental component and Berenice being the spiritual component. We can see that Eugeias is literally born within the library. He describes his world of dreams and imagining as the real one. His obsession emphasizes thought and study, while Berenice is this more spiritual presence, described both as a slith and a naiad. She's graceful and ephemeral. Berenice's value comes from her purity. Once she becomes ill, Eugeias speaks of her being morally compromised. And this ineffable spiritual quality cannot be the salvation of men. Ultimately, Berenice's spiritual nature crumbles when overly analyzed. And alternately, one could believe what is spiritual and sacred within a human being cannot be separated from them. Eugeias removes Berenice's teeth, her one remaining perfect untouched part. But he never possesses what he loved or admired about Berenice. And that's going to be everything there is to think about with Edgar Allan Poe's Berenice. I hope you enjoyed this examination of some of Poe's early works. As you can see over here, I've got a list of sources cited. This is going to be everything I read related to Berenice, whether or not I ended up implementing it, as sometimes I was reading something and a totally unrelated thought came to my head, and I don't really know the right way to source or credit any of that, so I just put them all here for further reading if you'd like to see it. I had a great time putting this together, and I hope you enjoyed the presentation. Thanks so much for coming with me on this journey. If you made it this far, leave me a tooth emoji in those comments down below. And as always, keep reading.